In the sense that on the one hand there will be a certain amount of excess capacity domestically in things like cement and things like steel, and infrastructure investment will provide demand for these sectors. Also internationally, where you could import, earlier you would have imported at much higher prices, now you will be importing at much lower prices, so it makes sense from that point of view also.
All right, Montek, I'm glad to see that we seem to be agreeing on some of these things. By the way, pushing infrastructure doesn't necessarily only mean government actually spending or investing. A lot of the push to the infrastructure could be given by the government providing financial guarantees, for example, and other steps to help the private sector complete the infrastructure projects it already has, which are ready to go.
Well, I think both are important. In our kind of context, government does a lot of infrastructure spending directly. Where projects are already ongoing, if it's possible to accelerate them by putting more money on completing them, that would be a very desirable thing to do. In the case of the private sector, there are many projects at different stages of approval and financing and tying up of financing. If some of them are having difficulty, we need to find innovative ways of overcoming those difficulties so that at least finance does not become a constraint in making these projects go ahead.
All right, so it's sounding as if you have on violent agreement on many of these fronts.
But I hope this is not, I hope this violent agreement is not embarrassing you as a TV anchor. You're supposed to be disagreeing with the government apparently all the time, is it?
No, not at all. In this case, we suggested it, so we can say that, government perhaps is agreeing. But anyway, if we are in agreement on many of these issues, and we are going to be getting other guests also to talk about it, can we expect to see the government actually announcing a massive infrastructure package in the near future?
Well, I don't know whether announcements, government expenditures are necessarily limited by what is voted by Parliament. So basically, you can't announce an expenditure that hasn't been approved. But you can accelerate expenditure in areas where projects are ongoing and acceleration is possible. Now, in the short run, meaning in the next month or two, it's not necessarily easy to start spending more on a project because there's a lot of mobilization and sort of refixation of process, etc., that has to be done. But certainly over the next year to 18 months, a lot of this could be done. And even in the short run, where there are projects capable of moving faster, it should be possible to redeploy resources or make available what are called extra budgetary resources, so that these expenditures take place faster than they otherwise would.
Montek Singh Ahluwalia, thank you so much for joining us on this program. Let me now toss to the other two guests whom I have. Ajit, let me just start with you. Part of the argument which I think we've been making now is that, yes, there are lots of stuff that the government should do in getting in liquidity and direct intervention in areas like banning short selling, which other countries are doing. But given that India needs infrastructure, is this the time to really go out and build it in a global recession?
Well, when we talk of building infrastructure, there are two kinds of way you build it. One is where government directly spends the money and builds the infrastructure, and the other where it seeks private partnership in order to build it, what we know commonly now as public-private partnership. Now when you look at, let's take the second part first, where you have a public-private partnership, you are staring at least a $75 billion or almost a 4 lakh crores of rupees worth of expenditure needed to be incurred this year. And when you look at that, you're talking about the 3G telephones, you're looking at the road program of the 21 big roads, you're looking at port programs, and you're looking at power, hydel as well as thermal. When you look at this in the public-private partnership phase, you need to bring in liquidity. So the answer is liquidity, 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 without which there is no possibility of public-private partnership.
So
the other is the government sector.
Right.
Where, as Montek rightly pointed out, we need to do it speedily, but we need to open up more in terms of making payments. For example, advances can be increased from 10% to 15%. The interest on advance has to be dropped so people will take advances. So there's a whole host of things that they need to do, which they need to do fast.
All right. you've done a lot on getting the financing and the funding together for infrastructure projects. If the government has to do something, should it be by directly going out and spending, or as Ajit said, indirectly by infusing liquidity, by giving guarantees, by helping the private sector to go out and build the infrastructure?
Vikram, I think we are looking at a very, very difficult scenario right now. And I think...
Are private sector companies finding it difficult to finance
infrastructure?
They are.
Yes, they are, because of the current condition of financial markets.
Are any of them going bust?
Well, I wouldn't hazard a guess, but you're reading the same papers I am and hearing the same news. So I would suspect that some of them are very, very stressed. Let me put it that way. But I think the need of the hour is, I think we don't have a choice but to be Keynesian. And we will have to have the government step in. And as has been said by Dr. Ahluwalia before, a huge dose of government intervention, government spending as a contra-cyclical, he used the phrase, measure, I think is called for. Now, there are three ways the government can do it. Yeah. The government can spend 100 rupees on its own and build a road worth 100 rupees.
Okay.
It can buy an EPC contract or giving it to the private sector. The government can have an intermediate scheme called annuity, where the private sector is shielded from market risk and makes it easier for the private sector to raise funds. The government can spend 100 rupees and get the private sector to raise another 500 and use the same 100 rupees to build road worth 600 rupees.
Fine.
And finally, the government can set up its own special purpose delivery vehicles like NHAI, Delhi Metro Rail Corporation, DMIC, and spend 1 rupee and leverage sovereign guarantees to raise 9 rupees worth and use the 1 rupee from the 100 rupees to do 10 times that. And I would suggest that the government should seriously consider government implementation of projects with EPC to the private sector and leverage 1 rupee of government expenditure to do 10 rupees worth of infrastructure projects.
I'm going to take a very quick break, and then after that I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask Ajit which of the various options that you've listed out are the correct ones, and also are private sector companies going to really find it tough to raise all the funds to do these infrastructure projects that have been lined up or not? That when we come back in a minute or two. Infrastructure, and company after company was doing well and announcing massive projects. To your mind, what percentage of those projects are not going to see the light of day eventually because the companies just will not be able to put the funding together?
Well, I think funding, this is not only a crisis of confidence, but it's a serious crisis of liquidity. And unless there is liquidity, companies will not have access to finance. We have also sucked out this entire financing in the country, entire liquidity in the country over the last few years, and as with the world crisis, it has worsened. And so we have now here a crisis of confidence as well as a crisis of liquidity. So until you restore that, the possibility of closing some of these public-private partnerships looks very bleak to me. So it's very important that we do that first. Second is a major structural reform of having a debt market in the country is absolutely essential. Though that cannot happen immediately, we must take immediate steps as a result of this crisis to introduce a debt market so infrastructure will be able to find 15-year, 20-year funding.
All right, Ajit.
This is as far as the public-private partnerships are concerned.
Right. Ajit, we are running flat out of time. When quick, what percentage of those projects that we've seen announced will not see the light of day?
Projects announced in the private sector?
Yeah. Or in the government sector, you name it.
Look, in the government sector, there are always delays. There's never a cancellation of a project. But I tend to agree with what Ajit is saying, that I think project after project, we are getting reports from the marketplace of great difficulties on financial closure. Even the ones that have received financial closure are not getting disbursement, although their contracts are signed and financial closure documents are signed. So a percentage would be difficult to guess, but I would say all of them are currently facing what Ajit said, are facing liquidity stress.
Okay, so spending our way out of the crisis, building infrastructure, and you still might need liquidity. I think that's a basic message that has come from both you and from Ajit. I'd like to thank you both so much for joining us on this special program. But let's see if we are actually going to get the government to do any of that additional Keynesian or counter-cyclical spending on infrastructure to add on to all the steps that countries around the world are already taking. If that happens, maybe we'll have some nice infrastructure when this crisis is over. That was the Survivor's Guide to the Crash of 2008. We'll be back again tomorrow night, same time. Bye for now.